June 4th, 1965, in orbit over Hawaii. On the second day of the Gemini mission over Hawaii, while White was asleep, McDivitt happened to see an unidentified flying object, which he described as looking like a beer can or a pop can, and with a little thing like maybe a pencil or something sticking out of it.
Now, Brigadier General Jim McDivitt not only was a former astronaut, he also claims to have seen an unidentified flying object. First, welcome here. When was that, General?
It was during the flight of Gemini 4, Mario, in June of 1965.
Could you describe this UFO for us?
Yes, it was a white object. If it had been about that high, it would have been about that big around and had a long white tube sticking out of it.
Any idea what it was?
I tried to take some pictures, but because of the way the camera was set and the way the light was shining on the windshield, we never really got anything back except a couple beautiful sunspots on the window, nothing else.
Yet you still believe that it was a UFO that you saw on that flight in orbit?
Well, it was a UFO. That means unidentified flying object. Whether or not it was life from another planet, I don't really know.
September 3rd, 1965, Exeter, New Hampshire. At approximately 2 a.m., 18-year-old Norman Muscarello was hitchhiking to his home in Exeter along New Hampshire Route 150. After reaching Kensington, a few miles outside Exeter, Muscarello noticed 5 flashing bright red lights in the distance, which he initially believed to be the lights of a police car or fire engine. As he drew nearer to the lights, he saw they were hovering in the air just above the trees and illuminated a nearby field and 2 houses in brilliant red light. Muscarello estimated the object to be 80 to 90 feet in diameter. He became terrified as the object, which made absolutely no sound, began to move steadily towards him. Panicking, he dived into a ditch beside the road. The lights changed direction and disappeared into the nearby woods. Muscarello flagged down a passing car and got a ride to the police station. Police officer Eugene Bertrand decided to drive Muscarello back to investigate the field where he had seen the lights. From Bertrand's patrol car, they at first saw nothing unusual. However, when they left the car and walked into the field and towards the woods where Muscarello had first seen the lights, some horses in a nearby corral began kicking the fence and sides of the barn, making loud, frightened noises. Dogs in the area also began barking and howling. Bertrand and Muscarello then saw an object slowly rise from the trees beyond the corral. Bertrand described the UFO as this huge dark object as big as a barn over there with red flashing lights on it. The object moves silently towards them, swaying back and forth. Instinctively remembering his police training, Bertrand dropped to one knee, drew his revolver, and pointed it at the object. He then decided that shooting would not be wise, so he reholstered the revolver, grabbed Muscarello, and both ran back to the patrol car. Bertrand radioed another Exeter policeman, David Hunt, for assistance, and while the two waited in the car for Hunt to arrive, they continued to observe the object. According to UFO historian Jerome Clark, Bertrand and Muscarello observed the object as it hovered 100 feet away and at 100 feet altitude. It rocked back and forth. The pulsating red lights flashed in rapid sequence from right to left, then left to right, each cycle consuming no more than 2 seconds. The local animals continued to act agitated. The object was still there when Hunt arrived, and he also watched it. The object finally rose over the trees and disappeared. Hunt soon heard the engines of a B-47 bomber as it flew overhead, and he later told journalist John G. Fuller that you could tell the difference between the UFO and the bomber. There was no comparison. All 3 men drove back to Exeter Police Station and immediately filed separate reports on what they had seen. Bertrand then drove Muscarello home and told his mother about the incident. July 1st, 1965, Valensole, France. An alleged UFO sighting and close encounter by farmer Maurice Massé. According to Massé, he encountered 2 small beings near a spherical vehicle that had landed in a nearby field. Massé claims that he was paralyzed when one of the beings pointed a tube-like object towards him. Massé said he watched the beings looking at plants and making grunting sounds until they returned to the vehicle and flew away. According to his wife, Massé said he received some kind of communication from the beings, considered his encounter a spiritual experience, and looked upon the site as hallowed ground that should be kept in his family forever. Ufologists considered Massey's claims significant and cite landing gear impressions found in the soil.
December 9th, 1965, Kecksburg, Pennsylvania. A large, brilliant fireball was seen in at least 6 U.S. states and Ontario, Canada, as it streaked over the Detroit, Michigan, Windsor, Ontario area. Reports of hot metal debris over Michigan and northern Ohio, grass fires, and sonic booms in the Pittsburgh metropolitan area were attributed to the fireball. Some people in the village of Kecksburg, about 30 miles southeast of Pittsburgh, reported wisps of blue smoke, vibrations, and a thump, and also that something from the sky had crashed in the woods. An early story in the Greensburg Tribune-Review stated the following: the area where the object landed was immediately sealed off on the order of U.S. Army and state police officials in anticipation of a close inspection of whatever may have fallen. State police officials there ordered the area roped off to avoid the expected arrival of both U.S. Army engineers and possibly civilian scientists. When state troopers and Air Force personnel searched the woods, they found absolutely nothing. A subsequent edition in the Tribune-Review bore the headline, "Searchers Failed to Find Object." There was a lot of speculation at the time that it was simply a meteor. 40 years later, NASA admitted that they had recovered metallic fragments from what they attributed to a Soviet satellite. April 6, 1966, West Hall High School, Melbourne, Australia. An American physicist known for his research into UFOs, Dr. James E. McDonald, conducted an interview with a science teacher from the West Hall School, Andrew Greenwood, who witnessed the event. He then recorded himself describing their meeting and the creepy details Mr. Greenwood gave about his experience. Greenwood told me the UFO was first brought to his attention by a hysterical child who ran into his classroom and told him, "There's a flying saucer outside," Mr. McDonald said. He thought this child had become deranged or something, so he didn't take any notice. But when the child insisted that this object was in the sky, he decided to go out and have a look for himself. When he went outside, he noticed a group of children looking towards the northeast area of the school grounds, and as he approached them, he claims he saw a UFO hovering close to the power line. Mr. Greenwood described it as a round, silver object about the size of a car, with a metal rod sticking up in the air. According to Mr. McDonald, the teacher then told him 5 planes came and surrounded the object as more people began gathering to watch the scene before them. He called it the most amazing flying he'd ever seen in his life. Dr. McDonald said, "The planes were doing everything possible to approach the object, and he said how they all avoided collision he would never know. Every time they got too close to the object, it would slowly accelerate, then rapidly accelerate, then move away from them and stop. Then they would take off after it again, and the same thing would happen." This game of cat and mouse reportedly went on for about 20 minutes, and by this time Mr. Greenwood said 350 children and staff were watching on. Suddenly, the UFO shot away and vanished within seconds, and it was at this point the headmaster came out and ordered everyone to go back to class.
This boy come running in and saying, Mr. Greenwood, there's these things in the sky, these things in the sky.
We looked up and we just saw this saucer type thing taking off.
It wasn't a plane, it wasn't a balloon, it was nothing like that.
A lot of the kids took off towards where it seemed to go.
All the students were just running all over the place, hysterical.
West Hall High School as a teaching situation ceased.
My girlfriend and I sat on the fence, climbed the fence, the school boundary, and we were crying, thinking it was the end of the world.
August 29th, 1967, Cussak, France. 2 children reported seeing a sphere-shaped UFO, 2 meters in diameter, and 4 little devils on the ground. The craft was of a bright silvery color and possessed landing gear consisting of 3 or 4 straight legs equipped with little round shoes 10 centimeters in diameter. One of the humanoid beings was bending over, apparently busy with something on the ground, and another held a mirror-like object. The creatures were completely black, but with a shiny look, which one of the kids compared to that of silk. The children could not be certain whether the color was that of the being's skin or some sort of protective suit, for there was no visible dividing line between any possible clothing and the heads of the beings, which were bare. If there was a protective suit of some kind, it was perfectly fitted. The arms were somewhat too long and thin. The children could not distinguish anything which might serve as hands. The legs were short and thin. The head seemed of normal proportions relative to the body, but the cranium, nose, and chin were equally pointed. At some point, one of the kids called out, "Have you come to play with us?" At this moment, the small beings, who did not seem to be interested in the children, became aware that they were under observation. The first one took off vertically and then plunged headfirst through the top of the sphere. The second followed in the same way, and the third, after getting up, did likewise. The fourth also got up, but before diving into the machine, came down again and seemed to pick up the mirror from the ground. Then the craft rose up into the air and left at a high rate of speed. October 4th, 1967, Shag, Harbour, Nova Scotia. Just before midnight, something crashed into the waters of Shag Harbour. At least 11 people saw a low-flying lit object and heard a whistling sound like a bomb, then a whoosh, and finally a loud bang. Named after the shag, a bird of the cormorant family, the harbour was literally off most maps of the time, but this event would change all of that. Local residents reported noticing strange orange lights in the sky that night. Most witnesses agreed that there were 4 orange lights that evening. 5 teenagers watched these lights flash in sequence and then suddenly dive at a 45-degree angle towards the water's surface. The witnesses were surprised that the lights did not dive into the water, but seemed to float on the water about 1/2 mile from the shore. Witnesses at first thought they were watching a tragic airplane crash and quickly reported as much to the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, which was located at Barrington Passage. Coincidentally, RCMP Constable Ron Pound had already witnessed the strange lights himself as he drove down Highway 3 en route to Shag Harbour. Pound felt that he was seeing 4 lights, all attached to one flying craft. He estimated the craft to be about 60 feet long. Constable Pound made his way to the shore to get a closer look at the phenomenal sight. He was accompanied by 2 other officers and some local residents. Pound clearly saw a yellow light moving slowly on the water, leaving a yellowish foam in its wake. The light ultimately faded into the distance or sunk into the water, according to the witnesses. By the time a Coast Guard cutter and other local boats got to the location, the light itself was gone, but the crewmen could still see the yellow foam. The HMCS Granby was ordered to the location where divers searched the bottom of the ocean for several days, but without positive results. The divers, along with other witnesses, related these events. The object that dove into the waters of the harbor had soon left the Shag area, traveling underwater for about 25 miles to a place called Government Point, which was near a submarine detection base. The object was spotted on sonar there, and naval vessels were positioned over it. After a couple of days, the military was planning a salvage operation when a second UFO joined the first. The common belief at the time was that the second craft had arrived to render aid to the first. At this time, the Navy decided to wait and watch. After about a week of monitoring the 2 UFOs, some of the vessels were called to investigate a Russian submarine that had entered Canadian waters. At this point, the 2 underwater craft made their move. They made their way to the Gulf of Maine, and putting distance between themselves and the chasing Navy boats, they broke the surface and shot away into the skies. January 6, 1969, Leary, Georgia. 2 years before he became governor of Georgia, Jimmy Carter was preparing to give a speech at a Lions Club meeting. He reported that about 7:15 p.m., one of the guests called his attention to a strange, bright, white object, about as bright as the moon, that was about 30 degrees above the horizon to the west of where they were standing. It moved towards their direction, but stopped beyond a stand of pine trees some distance from them. The object then changed color, first to blue, then to red, then to black, to white, before appearing to recede into the distance. Carter felt that the object was self-illuminated and not solid in nature. Carter's report indicates that it was witnessed by about 10 or 12 other people and was in view for 10 to 12 minutes before it passed out of sight. In 1973, Carter reiterated, "There were about 20 of us standing outside of a little restaurant, I believe a high school lunchroom, and a kind of green light appeared in the western sky. This was right after sundown. It got brighter and brighter, and then it eventually disappeared. It didn't have any solid substance to it. It was just a very peculiar looking light. None of us could understand what it was." During a Fuga Magister jet training mission at Pori Airport, a Finnish Defense Forces flight controller told pilot in training Tarmo Tukeva to investigate several air balloons that were floating at approximately 1,500 to 3,000 meters above the airport. Tukeva reported that the objects were ball or dish-shaped, but could not determine his distance to them. According to Tukeva, the objects accelerated away from him at great speed. Undetermined radar images were also later reported 200 kilometers away in Vasa. A second pilot in training, Juuko Koronen, says he overheard the radio communications between the flight controller and Tukeva, as well as observing the objects. According to the Finnish Armed Forces magazine, Urotuvaki, the April 12th reports were similar to other cases occurring over bodies of water during ongoing military training exercises and may have been due to transnational spy planes or aircraft. September 1st, 1969, Sheffield, Massachusetts. Thomas Reed and his family were crossing the bridge when they saw a dish-shaped object hovering in the air. Reed described the craft as a white orb that was bigger than a football field. They tried escaping the UFO by continuing to drive down Covered Bridge Lane, but the craft followed them. Reed said the car was engulfed in light as they were pulled into the UFO. When Reed took a polygraph test, he was found to be 99.1% truthful.
I'm very pleased to be able to be here this morning and to tell you what happened to me at that time. But first, I'd like to give you a little background of my life before this thing happened to me. I was born and grew up in southeastern Mississippi on a farm. I completed high school there in a small town and had begun junior college. But at that time, the Korean War had just started, so being a patriotic citizen, I quit college and joined the Army and spent 20 months and 16 days in combat in Korea. But after receiving an honorable discharge from the military, returned home and didn't further my college education. I had fell in love with a young woman, and shortly she became a wife. We've been together all these years. But anyway, I had started work in a large industry there in Laurel, Mississippi, not too far from my home. And I had continued there for 14 years, working my way up into management. And for different reasons, the company went under, had to go out of business, had too much competition in that field. But anyway, I moved my family to the Gulf Coast in Pascagoula, Mississippi, and started my career as a shipbuilder. And shortly after, about 5 years afterwards, in 1973, a friend of mine, his son, had come down to that area to go to work, Calvin Parker, and I was a foreman in the shipyard, and he had started to work for me. And knowing that from back home, he grew up with my kids in Jones County before we come to the Gulf Coast, and knowing Calvin, and him knowing me, he knew that I liked to fish occasionally, so we had planned on a Thursday evening to go fishing in October. And we had reached the river, the Pascagoula River, and we had fished for a couple hours after work, and it had become dark, or almost dark, and we were sitting on a pier fishing out into the river, and I heard some kind of, it seemed to me a hissing sound, like it could have been steam or air escaping from a pipe. And as I turned around from the pier and looked, something that had come almost to the ground. It was hovering probably 2 foot, 18 inches or 2 foot from the ground, and I assume Calvin had heard the noise at that time. He turned to look, and there was some kind of door, a sliding door, I suppose, that came into the end of the craft that was toward us, and a very brilliant light came out of the craft. And I didn't know what to do. It startled me at first. I couldn't make out what it was. And about that time, there was 3 things began to move into the doorway. They came out the beam of flight, came right up to Calvin and myself, and one took hold of this shoulder and one of this shoulder, and I seemed to rise up from the ground about the height that they were, and we proceeded to go into the craft.
August 23, 1974, New York City. John Lennon said he saw a thing with ordinary electric light bulbs flashing on and off around the bottom, one non-blinking red light on top, around 100 feet away hovering over an adjacent building. As I walked out onto the terrace, my eye caught this large circular object coming towards us. It was shaped like a flattened cone, and on top was a large brilliant red light, not pulsating as on any of the aircraft we see heading for a landing at Newark Airport. When it came a little closer, we could make out a row or circle of white lights that ran around the entire rim of the craft. These were also flashing on and off. There were so many of these lights that it was dazzling to the mind. Lennon said he saw the flying object from his apartment in the city. It wasn't a helicopter and it wasn't a balloon, and it was so near, Lennon said. The singer-songwriter said that the round object was black or gray in the middle, with blinking white lights wrapped around it and a red light on top. He said it flew past his window on a warm summer night and was so close he could have thrown a brick at it. The thing I noticed was there was no noise and I could hear the freeway down below. All the cars going. So I realized, oh, it's not a helicopter, so then it must be a balloon. Lennon said, but it was so close to the rooftop that it couldn't be a balloon. He took photos with 2 different cameras, but no photos came out. He then called the police, who reportedly said they had received similar calls that evening.
Over here, up there, I saw a UFO, and it went down the river, turned right at the United Nations, turned left, and then down the river. It wasn't a helicopter, and it wasn't a balloon, and it was so near.
And it looked what, sort of round, white, luminescent, and silent?
Silent, and it looked dark, like black or grey in the middle, and had white lights, just looked like light bulbs, you know? Just going off, on, blink, 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 blink. Round the bottom, and on top was a red light.
If you see a little note on walls and bridges, it says, I saw a UFO. And I was just finished doing walls and bridges. I'd mastered it, or done the last tape of it, and I was really just relaxed and feeling good. And it was summer in New York, and I had the window open, and lo and behold, there was this thing just hovering sort of 100 yards away. But I saw it so close, it wasn't in the sky or nothing, you know? And it was like I could have hit it with a brick if I'd thrown a stone at it. I couldn't see the colours because it was dusk. It was a good, clear summer night. You know, the sky was very clear. And round the bottom of it were just ordinary-looking electric light bulbs, blinking off and on alternatively, like on a billboard or something. And on the top of it was a red light. And the thing I noticed was that there was no noise, and I could hear that freeway down below, all the cars going. So I realized, oh, it's not a helicopter, then it must be a balloon. But it was so close to the rooftop that it couldn't be a balloon. So all the rational things I went through, it's not a helicopter, balloon. Not a balloon, it's too close to the roof. And it's maneuvering too well to be a balloon. So I just watched it, and it was there for about 5 or 10 minutes. It went off down the East River, and there it was, and that's all I've got to say about it.
It's the early hours of September 19, 1976, Tehran, Iran. A shining object was reported in the sky above the city by at least 4 civilians. Lieutenant Yadi Nazari of the Imperial Iranian Air Force, plus a backseat weapons officer, were dispatched in an F-4 Phantom II jet to intercept and investigate. Once Nazari reached Tehran, he reported losing all instruments and communications, so they returned to base, reporting that his instruments came back once he did. Major Parviz Jafari, an HAF squadron commander, along with First Lieutenant Jalal Damirian as weapons officer, were dispatched in a second F-14 Phantom II to intercept the object. Jafari acquired radar lock on the object at a range of 27 nautical miles, its size compared to a Boeing KC-135 Stratotanker. As he approached the object, which Jafari described as flashing with intense red, green, orange, and blue lights, so bright that I was not able to see its body, his plane's communication system shut off. As he attempted to fire an AIM-9 Sidewinder infrared-guided missile, his equipment shut down and only returned to normal after his jet moved away from the object. Jafari later said he was startled by a round object which came out of the primary object and started coming straight towards me at a high rate of speed, almost as if it were a missile. But as he attempted to fire, suddenly nothing was working. The weapon's control panel was out, and I lost all the instruments in the radio. When he could report to air traffic control, Jafari was instructed to return. As he did so, Jafari looked to his left and saw the primary diamond-shaped thing up there, and another bright object came out of it and headed directly towards the ground. Expecting an explosion that did not happen, he claimed, "It seemed to slow down and land gently on the ground, radiating a high, bright light." The next day, Jafari and Demirian flew by helicopter to the area where they thought the light hit the ground, finding nothing. Occupants of nearby houses only reported hearing a loud noise and a bright flash of light during the night.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Parviz Jafari, and I'm a retired general of Iranian Air Force. At about 11 p.m. on the evening of 18 September 1976, citizens were frightened by circling of an unknown object over Tehran, the capital city of Iran, at a low altitude. It looked similar to a star, but bigger and brighter. They reported it to the tower and was seen by Towerman 2. He alerted the Air Force Command Post, and Deputy General Yousefi decided to scramble an F-4 jet to investigate. The pilot in the first jet lost instrumentation and communication when he got too close to the brilliant object, so he headed back. About 10 minutes later, they scrambled a second jet which I was piloting. At the time, I was a squadron commander. I approached the object, which was flashing with intense red, green, orange, and blue. The light was so bright that I was not able to see its body. The sequence of flashes was extremely fast, like a strobe light. We locked on it with radar it was at 30 degrees left, at range of 25 miles. The size on the radar scope was comparable to that of a 707 tanker. 4 other objects with different shapes separated from the main one at different times during this close encounter. Whenever they were close to me, my weapons were jammed and my radio communications were garbled. One of the objects headed toward me. I thought it was a missile. I tried to launch a heat-seeker missile to it, but my missile panel went out. Another followed me when I was descending on the way back. One of the separated objects landed in an open area, radiating a high bright light in which the sands on the ground were visible. We could hear emergency squash at all the way, which was reported by other airliners flying at the time and continued for another couple of days. During my interview at headquarters, after the incident, the American Lieutenant Colonel Alan Moy took notes, but after it was over, I could not find him to talk with. Later, once classified document was released here in America through the Freedom of Information Act, the Defense Intelligence Agency documented the event in great detail, and it was sent to NSA, the White House, and the CIA. The DIA assessment said this case is a classic that meets all necessary conditions for a legitimate study of the UFO phenomena. Then I would be happy to answer questions and tell you more. Thank you.
May 10th, 1978, Emilcin, Poland. Jan Wolski was out driving a horse-drawn cart early when he says he was jumped by two short, green-faced humanoid entities about 5 feet tall. The two beings jumped onto Wolski's cart and, according to Wolski, sat next to him and started to speak in a strange language. Originally, he had mistaken them for foreigners because of their slanted eyes and prominent cheekbones. Wolski drove his cart with the two beings aboard to a clearing where he says a large object was hovering. According to Wolski, a purely white, unidentified flying object, about 15 feet in height and as long as a bus, hovered in the air at an altitude of about 16 feet. There were no notable external features of the craft. Wolski noticed that there were 4 objects on the craft made of a black material that appeared to be drill-like in appearance, which generated a humming sound. An elevator-like platform attached to the hovering craft descended to the ground. Wolski then claims that he was taken aboard the ship with 2 additional entities he met near the flying object. He was then gestured to undress. There were about 8 or 10 benches situated around the craft, each the size for one person to sit in. There were some rooks in front of the door, which were moving their legs and wings but seemed to be immobilized. Wolski claims that he was then examined with a tool that resembled 2 dishes or saucers. After this, he was ordered to redress, and it was then that he noticed that there was no lights or windows on the craft, only the daylight coming through the craft's door. Entities ate and offered him something like icicles, but he refused. The craft's interior was described as black with a grayish tint, similar to that of the creature's outfits. Afterwards, Wolski returned home to his family and notified them of what had just happened, urging them to come and see the floating craft. He notified his sons, who called other neighbors, and together they went to investigate the site. The grass where the craft had been had signs of usage in it, being trodden down, covered with dew, and paths coming in all directions. Wolski returned home, leaving the rest of the neighbors and family at the site. Wolski's sons claimed that there were footprints left behind by the beings, though they did not detail whether the footprints were larger or smaller than their own. A 6-year-old boy claims to have witnessed a bus-like craft hover over a barn, then climb high into the sky and vanish. (7 p.m., October 21st, 1978, Bass Strait, Australia. Frederick Valentic radioed Melbourne Flight Service at 7:06 p.m. to report that an unidentified aircraft was following him at 4,500 feet. He was told there was no known aircraft at that level. Valentic said he could see a large unknown aircraft which appeared to be illuminated by 4 bright landing lights. He was unable to confirm its type, but said it had passed about 1,000 feet overhead and was moving at high speed. Valentic then reported the aircraft was approaching him from the east and said the other pilot might be purposely toying with him. Valentic said the aircraft was orbiting above him and that it had a shiny metal surface and a green light on it. Valentic further reported that he was experiencing engine problems. Asked to identify the aircraft, Valentic radioed, "It's not an aircraft." His transmission was then interrupted by unidentified noise described as metallic scraping sounds before all contact was lost. December 6, 1978, midnight, Casa Nostra, Marzano, Italy. Pier Fortunato Zanfretta was examining the via Casa Nostra, and upon entering the backyard, saw a red oval object with a diameter of over 33 feet. At this point, he called his supervisor, who recalled him screaming. On turning around, Zanfretta reported running into beings who were almost 10 feet tall, with mottled skin as though they were fat or wearing a rumpled suit. The creatures had yellow triangular eyes and clawed feet. When the supervisor asked if he was being attacked by men, Zanfretta was to have responded, "No, they are not men," at which point communication was lost. Zanfretta was later found unconscious and in a state of shock by his colleagues. Later, when under hypnosis, Zanfretta would claim that the beings had abducted him and taken him into a bright room in their craft. He also added to the description of the alien beings saying, "They are green with triangular yellow eyes with big thorns. They have green flesh and their skin is full of wrinkles as if they were old. Their mouths look like they're made of iron. They have red veins on their heads, pointed ears, and arms with fingernails, with round things. They come from the third galaxy. November 11th, 1979, the skies over Manassas Airport in Valencia, Spain. Flight JK-297, a commercial flight of the Spanish company Transportes Aéreos Españoles, in a TAE Super Caravel, has taken off from Salzburg, Australia with 109 passengers on board and had made a refueling stop on the island of Majorca before settling course towards Las Palmas. Halfway through the flight at about 11 p.m., pilot Francisco Javier Lerdo de Tejada and his crew noticed a set of red lights that were fast approaching the aircraft. These lights appeared to be on a collision course with the aircraft, alarming the crew. The captain requested information about the inexplicable lights, but neither the military radar at Torrejón de Ardoz in Madrid nor the flight control center in Barcelona could provide any explanation for this phenomena. In order to avoid a possible collision, the captain changed altitude. However, the lights mirrored the new course and stayed about a half kilometer away from the plane. Since the object was violating all elementary safety rules and an evasive maneuver was deemed impossible by the crew, the captain decided on going off course and made an emergency landing in Manassas Airport. This was the first time in history in which a commercial flight was forced to make an emergency landing because of a UFO. The flight crew reported the lights abandoning the pursuit just before the landing took place. However, 3 new UFO signals were detected by the radar, each one with an estimated diameter of 200 meters. The objects were seen by several witnesses. One of the UFOs passed very close to the airport runway, and emergency lights were lit by the land crew in case the object happened to be an unregistered flight experiencing difficulties. Given the lack of answer to all communication attempts, a Mirage F-1 took off from the nearby airbase of Los Llanos, Albacete, to identify the phenomena. The pilot, Spanish Air Force Captain Fernando Camara, had to increase his speed to Mach 1.4 just to be able to get visual contact with what he perceived to be a truncated cone shape displaying a changing bright color, but despite his initial efforts, the object quickly disappeared from sight. The pilot was informed of a new radar echo, which indicated that another object might be near Sagunto, Valencia. When the pilot was close enough, the object accelerated and disappeared again. This time, though, the UFO seemed to respond and the fighter had its avionics scrambled. Its electronic flight systems were jammed and the onboard alert system in the F-1 warned Captain Camara as if he was being locked on by a continuous wave missile radar. At last, and after a third contact attempt, the UFO finally disappeared, heading for Africa. After an hour and a half of pursuit and due to fuel shortage, the pilot was forced to return to the base with no results.